All right, in this episode, we talk about wrist snap, finally.
And the UCL ligament.
All right, Brent Porcio, Stephen Godani here at the @Top Velocity #Pitch and Tip Show, where you go to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, at Top Velocity, @Stephen Godani. People have been hitting you up now.
Yeah.
You notice? #Pitch and Tips, #Baseball Tips. Now we're past episode 100. Congratulations.
All right. Congrats.
Episode 100. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Whatever. It's just 100. Hopefully we'll do 100 more. All right, and we're taking your questions. We've had great questions. We've got a list of questions on Twitter. I know I've seen questions on YouTube. We've got them on Instagram. I know we're having a hard time. Guys, we're having a hard time just keeping them together. So it might be smart to repost on other social networks just to constantly show us you want your answer or your question heard, and we will answer it. I mean, we love this, and we couldn't do it without you guys. We couldn't do it without all your questions. So
Absolutely.
We really appreciate it. We wouldn't be at 101 right now if it wasn't for you guys. So what's the question for today? Hans Hannes asks, what moves are in the wrist? Extension, flexion, owner, dev, what timing? What is this mysterious thing called wrist snap? All right, good question, Hans. Hey, you actually asked this question in the 100th episode, and I actually I hadn't addressed wrist in a while. So I'm gonna admit I needed to go back and look at it just because when you don't coach it enough, you forget about it. The reason I don't coach it is because it's the end of the chain, and there's everything it does it's almost probably 90% of what it does is just a reaction to what the lower parts of the chain have caused it to do. The only thing that it's really doing is it's gripping the ball. So your wrist or above your wrist is gripping the ball. Besides that, there really isn't any wrist snap. So that old school wrist snap we talked about the other day, Steve and I are kind of going over it for the second time, but like I said, I'm doing it better, hopefully, is that you hear a lot of this wrist snap coming up in the lower levels of the game, and you're like, okay, what does this mean? Am I actually pulling the ball down? Am I distinctively pushing it out and trying to extend? Am I doing this? Remember that old drill where you'd hold your glove? Is that how it is? Is you push through like that? Because you hear change-ups is you don't want to create that. So I guess in fastballs you're doing that. So what's going on? I'm gonna actually show a video here of Tim Lincecum. I got that slow motion video, Red Bull video. We can watch it. I watched that the other night. Then I went and back and read some of the articles I wrote. And what is happening is the arm is pretty much in flexion all the way to pitch release. There is a moment of extension, but it's a recoil action. Remember, in the pitching delivery, everything that goes up the kinetic chain, which is basically from the ankles all the way up to the wrist, is an action reaction. The action of the hips driving and the shoulders closing creates a reaction of the shoulder rotation. The action of the arm adducting and the arm external rotating, the reaction is internal rotation. So if we go into the wrist, of course there's gonna be an action of the wrist to externally rotate, but because the wrist extends and pronates, there's actually two actions, there's two actions. There's an action of flexion and there's an action of supination. And we talked about in a previous episode of how do we create good pronation is we actually learn how to create good supination, okay, or how supination works with the arm path. In the case of wrist snap, there really is no wrist snap that you are creating. It's something that is a kind of reaction to the process, and the more we get into flexion, so that we go into supination and we go into some flexion, specifically when we start going into rotation, we really the arm gets pulled into flexion. And then because internal rotation, specifically in a high velocity pitcher, happens earlier, in a high velocity pitcher, you're gonna see some extension. So I think that's what coaches, when they think snap the wrist, it's because they're watching these high velocity pitchers who look like they're more extended at pitch release with that wrist. And it's only because the arm is internally rotating, which is causing the reaction to happen earlier up at the end of the chain. So, because if you look at a low velocity pitcher, they're still trying to internally rotate out in front of their face, so it looks like they're more in flexion at release, which they are. So you might, like I said, the bad coaching tip would be to extend the wrist, but really it is to internally rotate and pronate earlier. That's going to create extension on the wrist and pitch release earlier, which is what we're talking about. So the point is, wrist snap is conventional. It doesn't really help us understand what is going on and how to coach the movement. It always happens down chain. So if you want something up here to do a certain thing, it had to do more of what you did down here or what you did down here to make it do that. And remember, you're going to see someone getting extended on their wrist earlier because they're internally rotating earlier, and that's typical of a high velocity pitcher who, if you move it down the chain, gets more hip to shoulder separation, more back leg, hip rotation or hip drive, more momentum off throw, all the things that you do up the chain to get that arm to explode into internal rotation and make that wrist look like it's snapping, which really it is, but it has nothing to do with them consciously creating extension in that wrist.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we feel like we're doing this again because we're doing it better this time, but anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just compared it to a story that, like, in high school, like, one of our coaches was, like, telling one of the guys, like, oh, once you figure out the wrist snap, like, you're going to get it, man. Like, that's it. It's like the wrist snap. And, like, now looking back at it, I just think it's, like, so funny that we're teaching, like, the very, very, very end of the chain of wrist snap. Like, that's going to be, like, that's it. Like, you're going to figure it out from the little thing of a wrist snap. So I just think it's funny that people aren't, like, figuring out by now that it all starts with the kinetic chain. Like, I was like a $135, probably jumping 17, 18 inches, and it's a wrist snap that's going to get me, throwing harder. So I just think it's funny how little of an understanding of the lower half and of the kinetic chain like the baseball world has.
Yeah, it's like with a whip. You wouldn't try to move just the end of the whip or try to make the end of the whip change by moving the end of the whip. You would do something different in the beginning of the whip to create the end or change the end of the whip. And that's really what we're saying here. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up your vertical because congratulations, Steven. Steven hit 30 inches today.
Yep, 30.6. I was pretty excited about it, but now I wasn't as excited as I thought I would be. Now it's just like, okay, great. Now I gotta get to 40.
But it's like almost you're a man.
Yeah, almost, man. My balls almost dropped.
God, the rating is down. Yeah. All right, next question. Joseph Butler asks, is there any way to strengthen my elbow ligaments? If so, then how? Good question. It kind of goes with the end of the chain here. So the ulnar collateral ligament is the UCL. It's just a tissue that holds the ulnar into the humerus. They almost look like spoons, and then there's this tissue, the ligament in there that prevents it from sliding. And when it's a ligament, it's actually not a muscle, so it can't contract like a muscle. And it doesn't get a lot of blood flow, so it's very vulnerable to tear, obviously, right? How do we strengthen that? But there is studies that show throwers typically have thicker ligaments in the throwing arm than in the non-throwing arm. So how do we strengthen the ligament, which would also be just really slowly building torque in the elbow, but not to the place of tearing it. Anytime you put stress somewhere, scar tissue builds, and that ligament is tissue, so it's going to strengthen or hypertrophy. And so that's what happens. So, going out there obviously throwing could hypertrophy and strengthen that ligament, but at the same time too, it also can tear it and break it down and injure it. So it's a catch-22. You got to be careful. You do want to throw more, but you don't want to throw too much. And so it's that gradual increase of throwing. Also too, in strength and conditioning, in forearm strengthening, and anywhere where you're pumping blood in there and adding torques and loads, it's going to strengthen that area as well. So anytime we basically work in this area as healthy as we can with a joint integrity routine, you can go into whatever you want, rice buckets, dumbbell work, just grip strength work. All these things would be great for strengthening that area. Also will apply some hypertrophy to the ligament, but that's not the only strategy. It's not like you're going to go out there and try to hypertrophy your ulnar collateral ligament so it can't tear. You really want to learn to strengthen the flexor mass, the biceps, triceps in that area, because that is more important to the ligament health than just hypertrophying the ligament. 80% of the load is typically handled by the integrity of the, I don't know, 80%. Now I'm going to go back and read this study now, but the majority of the stress comes from the integrity of the muscle strength in that area. Okay, so you want is, because the UCL can handle what? It's like the UCL can handle up to like 34 newtons or something like that, or 64 newtons in this one study, and that was roughly like 82 to 85 miles per hour. Basically, they took cadavers and they just bent the arm into external rotation until the UCL popped, and it was typically around that much force, which typically averages out in the 80, low 80s, mid 80s fastball. So if you're someone throwing 95, obviously your ligament isn't handling 95. That there's a big importance of the other muscles to compress the joint and stabilize the joint. So, but understand that really all come together. If I'm going to work in this area with strength development, I'm going to also, if I'm doing it healthy and right, I'm going to also promote hypertrophy of the UCL. So it really just kind of has to be a focus of this joint. At the same time too, we've talked about before, if you just strengthen this joint and you don't strengthen this joint, then this joint's going to take more load because now you have a stronger joint here. So this is going to take more torque. And then, of course, they say, studies show the scaps, the glenohumeral joint is not stable if the hips aren't stable at front foot strike. So now you got to go in and strengthen the glutes and the hips and the legs, and you got to be able to mechanically create a good stable base. So there's so much to elbow health, and that's why they've really never figured it out or given it one issue or one reason, right? Because there's so much going on and there's so many things influencing it. So just working on just that area wouldn't be enough. You got to focus on every joint in the chain and mechanically how to stable and put them in the right positions and how to strengthen it effectively off season, preseason, in season. There's just so much to it, and obviously everything we do down here with Top Velocity and the 3X Pitch Velocity program or the 2X programs is the focus on all these pieces to the puzzle. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think Brent nailed it on that. Like the study's saying, like if you can't stabilize the hips, then you can't stabilize the shoulder. If you can't stabilize the shoulder, you can't stabilize the elbow. So you really just have to look on where the weakest link in your kinetic chain is and build everything up and start learning how to get the whole thing moving efficiently. And if that means adding more stability to your shoulder, getting a more powerful base to stabilize the hips, you just kind of got to get into what your deficiency is and really work towards it.
Awesome. All right. If you have a question, go to Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, Snapchat. Ask your question. We'll answer on the show. TopVelocity.net. Check out the 2X, 3X programs. We got a lot of 3X camps coming up. Come on down here and train with us, and we'll see you on the next episode.